everybody, welcome to another episode of OK Talks on Video. We are moving up in the world. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with a background in international relations and security policy who's worked in domestic US politics and also had the good fortune to have visited and lived in a number of countries besides just my own. From channeling those experiences, I do my best on this show to translate what's going on in my own country for my non-US listeners, but to help shed some light for the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. So today's episode very much falls into category 2 there. I wanted to put out a quick-ish take because I've gotten questions from more than one person in the audience about the European elections that happened the other day, where the top line takeaway is that things have swung toward the right. I think this is alarming to a lot of people in my audience, not just because my audience skews left and doesn't like when right-wing politicians do well, but also because it's sort of reminiscent of how in 2016, just a few months before Trump unexpectedly managed to scrape a win in the US presidential election, despite losing by over 3 million votes. Before that, there was another political shocker across the Atlantic that seemed to represent a victory in the form of Brexit, a victory for the right in the form of Brexit. So for obvious reasons, people are worried about the fact that this happened here. And well, yeah, I can see that. So now I have to just say here, I am not an expert in EU level politics. So I want to just put that caveat out there and suggest that for that reason, and because these elections also just happened and the interpretations are all still kind of fresh, that you take everything I say here with a healthy grain of salt. With that said, though, I do have some thoughts about this election result that I think could be informative for segments of my audience that are back in the States or elsewhere, wondering what just happened over here in Europe. So before I get into them, I want to just remind anybody who hasn't already done so to remember to subscribe to the show so you don't miss the next episode, and to please do me the favor of hitting like or leaving a comment or sharing the show with anybody else you think might be interested. It really is helpful, so thanks to anyone who has. Thanks in advance to anyone who will. So that top line takeaway from these EU elections, that they represent a sort of shift to the right. Now, although it's not a huge shift, it's not going to massively alter the politics of the European Parliament, but yeah, it definitely did represent a win for the right, these elections this last weekend did. So what's instructive within that is not just the move to the right, but the flavor of right-wing parties that made gains here in a number of places, particularly in Germany and France. I'll get more into that point in a minute, but first it has to be said, without wanting to do an exhaustive explanation of how the European Parliament and its elections work, partly because I don't think that's fully relevant to the most interesting conclusions to be drawn from these elections, partly because it's super complicated and would take ages, and partly because my own level of knowledge and expertise on that is lacking enough that I'm definitely not the right man for that job. Just to say in brief, though, the way party coalitions work here is a little bit complicated in that in most countries, as I understand it, people vote for their national level parties, which then send representatives to the transnational European Parliament, and then there are EU level parties that are made up basically of coalitions of those national level parties. With that being the case, I think a lot of voters in Europe do sort of channel national level issues in their vote here, and that is part of why it is necessary to say to supplement the point that I was starting to make earlier and will continue to make in a second, that when I say what's instructive about this election result is not just the move to the right, but the flavor of the right-wing parties that made gains here. That doesn't really apply everywhere in Europe. In Spain, for example, whose politics I know better than any other European country, most of the gains on the right went more to the sort of traditional, normal right-wing party, and not as many to the creepy far-right party of the sort that I'm referring to, having made gains, particularly in France and Germany. Okay, so with that stated, as I've been saying, a key thing to notice here in a number of places, although not all, is not just the fact that the political right did well, but the type of right-wing parties that made gains. As I've also said, I think there's plenty of conclusions that could be drawn as to what these results mean. But to me, the results of these elections, more than anything else, say something about immigration. The question of borders and security, the relevance of which I'll explain in a second. Now, I've noticed for a long time, even before I moved to Europe, and it's been pointed out by people like Joe Scarborough on MSNBC, Sam Harris, others, that the conversation in Europe about immigration has been I'm struggling to find an adjective to characterize it, so I'm just going to describe what I mean, and we'll see if one comes to me. Basically, for the last decade or two at least, the idea that there should be, or could be really, any sort of restrictions on immigration has been effectively driven out of most mainstream European parties in most European countries. And I don't just mean that most of the parties took a very pro-immigration position. I mean that advocates for, like, at all more restrictive immigration policies have often been kind of summarily dismissed as like xenophobes or racist or neo-Nazis or something. Now, for the record, gross xenophobes and neo-Nazis kind of by definition would, of course, support restricting immigration. But that does not mean that anyone supportive of a less unfettered immigration policy is by definition a xenophobe or a racist. But if you basically just banish, like, even the discussion of maybe taking a slightly more restrictive approach to immigration from the political mainstream, well, then the only people who are going to be left talking about that are going to be parties that up until now have been outside the mainstream, the kinds of parties that are, going to be less likely to be deterred by accusations of xenophobia or racism or anything else that most of us would be seriously concerned by. So for that reason, especially, and some others, the effective shunning of even conversation about immigration in Europe, I think, is not a good thing in the long term for Europe or for the liberal West more broadly. I'll say more about that in a minute. Now, before I continue, there is something that I have to say to my listeners in the US, especially, and I say this with love, but there is often a tendency among Americans, as I suppose there is probably with everyone, but I think this is especially true of people who live in a country that is huge, culturally dominant, by far, has the most attention paid to it of any country in the world, where the vast majority of what we read and see is about us. There is often a tendency among Americans to view situations in other parts of the world through the lens of like our own history and our own context, and to sort of like copy paste our own situation and conflicts onto stuff going on in the rest of the world that sometimes really had nothing in common with our own experience to which we've just related it. Now, the most front of mind example right now of this is, of course, the tendency of a bunch of people to analogize the war in Gaza and the broader Arab-Israeli conflict to the US's own legacy of colonization and horrible mistreatment of Native Americans, or, just more broadly to view the Arab-Israeli conflict through the prism of America's own racial divides. Now, I should say, this has been actively pushed by anti-Israel lobbying groups, and I am really tempted right now to launch into a point-by-point refutation of various of those deliberately placed misconceptions. But I don't want to get sucked down a rabbit hole and taken away from the topic at hand. So I will just say that what I described is straight up information warfare that, besides actively damaging the peace process and making it less likely that the Israel-Palestine conflict will ever be resolved peacefully, it specifically takes advantage of, draws on this tendency that I'm talking about of Americans to like copy paste stuff from our own politics and history onto things going on in other parts of the world that are actually not similar at all. So I bring up that tendency because another place where I've often seen it come into play is in the way that Americans tend to think about questions of immigration in Europe. Now, those of us who are supportive of a more open approach to immigration in the US tend to assume that the same like factors and variables at play in the US also apply in Europe. But they don't, for a number of reasons. First of all, the open borders internally within the Schengen zone. And now, for anybody who doesn't know, the Schengen zone is basically, a group made up of most countries within the European Union, which have eliminated their internal borders with each other. That is to say, you can walk across the border from Spain to France, from France to Germany. There's no customs check there. That elimination of borders internally, which is a very good thing for a lot of reasons, does effectively impede the ability of individual countries in the EU to actually regulate their own immigration. Like, for example, I have come up through the ranks of immigration here in Spain. Now, as far as I understand it, because Spain chose to do that, I could now take that and go live and work in, say, Poland if I want to, without Poland having a whole lot of say in the matter, which certainly doesn't apply in the United States. Individual states don't have the right to vet and accept a person from outside the country and then have them gain access to the rest of the country. It's handled at the federal level rather than being done at the state level, which is, per the analogy here. Another difference between the US and Europe in terms of immigration is the reality that the United States was built by like wave upon wave of immigration. Like our whole identity stems from this. It's a point of pride amongst we liberals in particular. The US is called a melting pot because it's a country that is made up of many different cultures that have over time sort of blended together. This is not the case in Europe, which does not have the same history or experience of assimilating large groups of immigrants into their longstanding and pre-existing national cultures, which remain pretty distinct from each other. To use the same like country example from before, the difference between a Pole and a Spaniard is a hell of a lot bigger than the difference between a New Yorker and a Texan. And neither individual European countries nor the continent as a whole have the same experience with this as the United States does. As welcoming as European countries recently have been in terms of making it like physically easier in the form of looser enforcement, access to a generous array of benefits that are not so available in the United States, those distinct national identities in Europe that are not built on a history of immigration make it considerably more difficult for an immigrant to say, like, become German or become Italian than for an immigrant to the United States to become an American. Additionally, as I referred to a second ago, European governments take on a lot more responsibility to care for people in their countries than the United States does. And the vast majority of European countries have way better systems than the US does for access to healthcare, unemployment, welfare, various other sorts of benefits that are covered by taxpayers, which makes the stakes kind of higher for European voters in terms of the question of just how many people from outside they want to have join the team, as it were. Now, I say none of that as a criticism of either the way the US handles immigration or of the way individual European countries or Europe as a whole handles immigration. I have opinions about various of those things that I just outlined there, but the purpose of me laying that out was not for me to like weigh in on them individually, although, I do just want to say here as an immigrant to Spain how grateful I am to my adopted second country for how generous it's been to me. Rather, though, I laid out that stuff in order to like lay out just some of the ways, and there are others, in which the question of immigration in Europe is a different one than is the case in the United States. And the fact that a lot of Europeans would maybe be supportive of some changes to how the questions of immigration and assimilation of migrants are handled here does not mean that the majority of European voters are now basically like interchangeable with Trump supporters. Like, yes, sure. There are definitely people here that are like, gross mouth-breathing xenophobic assholes who are basically just Stephen Miller in lederhosen or a beret. But I think the gains that were made this last weekend by far-right parties aren't only coming in the form of like the kind of people that a left-leaning American audience might imagine when they conjure up the image of a proponent of restricting immigration, but rather, I think at least partially these results can be attributed to the fact that, as I was saying earlier, if you just banish even the conversation about immigration from polite society, well, voters who are worried about it are going to start gravitating to the only parties left that are actually talking about it, even if the ones talking about it are often unsavory, to say the least. Another related thing that I haven't touched on yet, but which I think is critical to the way this is thought about in Europe that is different from the United States, is the extent to which I think the theme of immigration in Europe is tied more directly to questions of security, terrorism in particular, than is the case in the United States. I mean, sure, the Republicans will try like all the time to use immigration to like gin up fears about crime and demagogue the issue and beat Democrats over the head with it, but the crime stats show pretty clearly in the US that there is a much higher, well, not much higher, but at least higher crime rate among native-born US citizens than among immigrants. When they're really grasping at straws to try to elicit some trouser soiling in the weeks before an election, when Fox News will have inevitably noticed and started endlessly covering a caravan of migrants coming up from Central America, Well, then they'll argue that chaos at the border is going to result in a bunch of jihadists entering the United States and wreaking havoc. But, but outside the second Sicario movie, I'm not aware of this ever having happened. Insofar as there has been big instances of Islamic extremist violence, hitting the United States, it's rarely happened in a way that could be plausibly blamed on an overly permissive immigration policy. I think, insofar as Republicans are ever able to make gains on the issue of immigration politically, I think it has more to do with channeling garden variety xenophobia or the old red herring about them taking our jobs or public dislike of chaos around the border than it does with, genuine fears about security vis-a-vis terrorism. I think, though, that the same just cannot be said of Europe. I'm not familiar enough with the crime stats of individual European countries to have anything to say about crime more broadly. But in terms of the question of security in the context of terrorism specifically, well, the biggest, most nationally traumatic terrorist attacks in American history have largely come from the outside, from people who had no serious ties to the United States and from places that are not associated with high levels of immigration to the US. In Europe, on the other hand, basically every high profile Islamic extremist attack in Europe over the past 2 decades has been carried out primarily by people who had at least lived in Europe for a while as immigrants or actually held European passports as first or second generation immigrants who were either radicalized online or in jihadist friendly mosques, most famously the Finsbury Park Mosque in the UK, whose imam was ultimately arrested on terrorism related charges in the mid 2000s. Now, this was true of the high-profile train bombings in Madrid and London in the mid-2000s, and it was true of the wave of ISIS-inspired attacks in Western Europe in the 2010s, like the Brussels bombings, the mass shooting at the Bataclan Theater in Paris, the van attacks in Nice and Barcelona, various others. Now, for the record, I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood here at all. None of that is me saying that open immigration policies in general are responsible for jihadist violence, or that immigrants in general are responsible for jihadist violence, or that people from Muslim majority countries in general are responsible for jihadist violence, or that Muslims in general are responsible for jihadist violence. Islamic extremists are responsible for jihadist violence. With that said, I think, for the reasons that I outlined, that I'm right to suppose that in Europe, fears of Islamic extremism and jihadism are more closely connected with questions about immigration than is the case in the United States. And that, along with the other things that I outlined before, coupled with the existing pattern of growth over the last little while among far-right parties across Europe whose calling card is specifically a promise to restrict immigration, well, those are reasons why I think that the most important conclusion to be drawn from these European elections is that many Europeans are not comfortable with the way immigration has been being handled for quite some time in Europe, and do not feel that that question is being adequately addressed by the mainstream political parties. As David Frum, Sam Harris, Joe Scarborough, various others have said in some form, and I'm just going to quote David Frum here, when liberals insist that only fascists will defend borders, then voters will hire fascists to do the job liberals won't do. Or as I kind of said earlier, if you basically declare even the conversation about in any way restricting immigration to be racist or xenophobic or in some other way beyond the pale, well, then the only people left talking about it are going to be people that are, or at least don't mind being called, racist or xenophobic or in some other way beyond the pale, which is not good. Because when normal voters start, for whatever reason, to be worried about the issue of immigration, well, then they'll have nowhere else to turn. And what we get is growth in support for yicky far-right parties. But Oliver, you might reasonably ask, why would voters in Europe be worried about immigration more broadly or Islamic extremism specifically right now? We haven't been, in the middle of a sort of wave of big jihadist attacks that we were in the mid 2010s. Well, valid question. I have a theory. So in addition to the slowly growing frustration around immigration here more broadly, although there haven't been any big mass casualty jihadist attacks in Western Europe for a couple of years, there have been a continuing stream of smaller attacks, like the case of the French teacher Samuel Paty. I'm sure I butchered the name, and my apologies to his family, who was decapitated a few years ago by an Islamic extremist who was outraged that he had, after, for the record, warning the students he was going to and doing so specifically in a class about the notion of free speech. This teacher, showed a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad and, as a result, got his head cut off. Like this sort of thing gets attention. I mean, a lot of us on the left see an event like that, and understandably, our first worry is about the potential for backlash against minority communities or immigrants, or concern about anti-Muslim bigotry. But that kind of attack, it's not just a run-of-the-mill murder. It's an assault on the French way of life. And when we on the left fail to understand that many people will take it that way and fail to address it as such, well, we liberals will pay the price politically. In addition to these sorts of events occurring every so often over the last few years, more recently, there have been a number of shows of force, we might say, that would have the effect of putting concerns about radical Islam back in the focus of European voters after it had started to fade over the last couple of years. There have been, since the October 7th attacks, which Europeans incidentally did notice, there have been many instances of big anti-Israel protests here that have often, similar to such protests in the US, as I discuss in episode 65 of OK Talks, have often gone pretty far beyond just earnest concern for the welfare of the people of Gaza and justifiable outrage over what a horrible situation they're suffering through right now. Like, a lot of people over here have seen videos of, anti-Israel protesters physically attacking Jewish kids in parts of Europe, like defacing property, waving around the flags of known terrorist organizations, carrying signs calling for jihad and martyrdom, etc. Like, this may have gotten less coverage, maybe, than it has in the States. Like the guy outside the White House the other day who was straight up cosplaying, I hope cosplaying, dressed up as a Hamas terrorist. And there may be less support in general for Israel in Europe than there is in the United States. But a lot of Europeans, I think, don't like this, especially given the reality that for multiple reasons, they are more at risk from jihadist attacks than Americans, and it's happened more recently here. So it's a bit more front of mind. I, I can't believe I'm actually about to talk about a singing competition on here, and it's probably ridiculous, and it's probably ridiculous that I'm even taking this seriously, but I did start having a feeling recently that there might be a sort of silent majority in Europe that, although largely very sympathetic, as for the record am I, to the plight of the people of Gaza, is also starting to grow a little tired of all the furious public displays of anti-Israel sentiment that often bleeds over into support for jihadist organizations. I started having this feeling a little while ago watching the Eurovision singing contest over here. Now, a lot of my American friends may not have ever heard of this, but it is a huge deal over here. I think the closest analog, back home, I think would be The Voice. Multiply the audience by a bajillion. But I don't know, basically, it's a huge singing competition involving most EU countries and a few from outside the European Union, including countries like Azerbaijan and Israel. So contestants compete first within their own countries, and then the winner goes to this multinational finals, and it's all televised, and millions of people watch it. But the thing is, people watching can then vote on their phones. There's an official sort of portal for voting. They can vote who they think the winner should be, which often reflects geopolitics to at least some degree. And in the end, the winner is chosen from that vote and from the vote of experts from various countries. Super delegates, one might say. Now, there was a ton of mess around the Eurovision competition this year. The final took place in Malmö, Sweden, where the 20-year-old girl from Israel had to be ferried around the city in a bulletproof caravan and couldn't leave her hotel room because they couldn't guarantee her safety in the context of the hordes of anti-Israel protesters who showed up to picket the hotel. I know it sounds insane that this would happen around a fucking singing competition. Google it if you don't believe me. But okay, the Israeli contestant came in, I don't know, fifth or sixth place, didn't do that well among the public, experts whose motives I won't speculate as to, but among the actual popular vote, the vote cast by people who were able to make this show of support from the privacy and safety of their own houses, she won, by a pretty decent bit. I don't know. I might be reading into it too much, but whether it's garden variety xenophobia, or anti-Muslim bigotry, or concerns over a long-term cultural impact of unchecked immigration, or short-term concerns about the potential for another wave of jihadist violence. I do think that some of the very large protests in various European capitals, which have often involved pretty overt displays of support, not just for innocent Palestinian civilians caught in the crossfire, as I say, but also for, well-known terrorist organizations, some of which have themselves carried out attacks in Europe in the past. Well, those events probably helped put anxiety about immigration back at center screen, which quite obviously has benefited not just the political right in Europe, but specifically the sort of far-right parties that unfortunately come with a whole bunch of other unsavory elements. Now, people look back fondly on the activism in the 60s against the Vietnam War, but they often seem to forget that a lot of the country, it would appear, did not actually respond very positively to the chaos and craziness that often came along with those protests. And, in the very next election after that wave of protests in 1968, a straight up racist, like neo-Confederate nutcase won 46 electoral votes. And ultimately, the presidency went to Richard Nixon, who then, prolonged the war for years. And I'm afraid there might be, a lesson to be learned there. And before I wrap up here, I just want to make one other point that I probably should have made both more and earlier in the episode, which is that almost everything that I've described so far looks to me like another indicator of the long-term success of a pretty obvious Russian strategy to destabilize the European Union. So, back in the Syrian civil war, when President Obama, who, yes, I love President Obama, he was otherwise a great president, but he did get this one catastrophically wrong. When Obama ignored the advice of John Kerry and Hillary and virtually every other serious person in the foreign policy arena and chose to not put a no-fly zone over the northern part of Syria to stop the Assad regime's vicious bombing campaign against his own civilians, well, Russia took advantage of that vacuum to get in the game themselves, and they helped Assad's military to create an absolutely catastrophic humanitarian disaster in Syria, which triggered a massive wave of refugees. Now, besides Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, basically all of the other major countries in the region refused to lift a finger to help. So this triggered a flow of millions of people, first from the Middle East and then from Libya and other places, once it became clear that, there's a very bad situation where I am, and now evidently a bunch of us can just go to Germany. And I say Germany very much on purpose here, because my understanding is that it was basically the German chancellor who made the decision effectively unilaterally to allow millions of unvetted people into the country. Now, it has to be noted, this was an incredible humanitarian gesture, a heroic thing that Germany did, made at a time of crisis. And, although I think it was complicated to say the least, I'm not saying any of this as a criticism of Angela Merkel necessarily, the chancellor at the time. But the thing is, for the reasons that I described earlier, having to do with the internal border situation in the context of the Schengen zone, this, unilateral decision by Merkel's Germany effectively meant that everyone that they decided to allow into Germany now also got free access to every other country in the Schengen zone, whose voters and leaders really had no say whatsoever in the matter. And a lot of them did not like it. As I've discussed, voters with anxiety for whatever reason about immigration are going to look at how the available political parties address the question of immigration. For the last little while in Europe, most mainstream parties have just kind of steered clear of that topic, thus leaving the field totally open to far-right parties of varying degrees of grossness and xenophobia and fascism-iness. Parties which also, by coincidence, tend to be either perfectly aligned with the Russians' foreign policy agenda in the form of being opposed to either the EU integration or just straight up openly pro-Russian. There were, actually just over the last couple of months, a couple of scandals where far-right politicians in Europe were in fact found to have been paid off by the Russians. So in summary, step one, trigger a massive migration crisis by helping your vicious ally trying desperately to hold on to power to bomb a huge chunk of his civilian population into Europe. Step two, quietly assist the political parties whose interests align with yours who are most likely to benefit from the migration crisis. Step three, more election results like this one. The center-right party that was in power before these elections will remain so after them. But the takeaway for me from these European elections is that the long-term failure of mainstream, like not crazy political parties in Europe to at least give voters the impression that they were interested in addressing concerns around immigration. I'm not even suggesting that they needed to implement super restrictionist policies, but even appearing interested in the conversation. The I think this electoral result shows the damage resulting from the long-term failure of mainstream parties in Europe to do that, and the Russian campaign to exacerbate and exploit those concerns. Those two things combined are having an effect. I just hope against all hope that this does not, as was the case in 2016, represent a harbinger of what's to come in the upcoming US elections.